Today on the Perception and Action podcast, a brief look at the incredible career of Michael Turvey and his contributions to the ecological approach to perception action. So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Now on to the show. Okay, in this episode, I want to talk briefly about the legacy of Michael Turvey. I think as most of my listeners know, Michael passed away this past August. I was fortunate enough to be invited to speak at UConn, I think last February, March. So I had some time to visit with him before he passed away, which was really nice. For this episode, I don't want to kind of try to catalog all the amazing things and contributions Michael has made, all his publications, right? I've covered that a lot in previous episodes. If you go look at episodes on coordinative structures or strong anticipation or the degrees of freedom problem, Michael had his fingerprint over so many things, right? I don't want to try to catalog. What I want to try to do in this episode is do a combination of my personal reflections and talk about a published interview with him that was published in 1997, right? And he added some reflections later on. There's a link in the show notes to that. I think I would go have a look at that if you're interested. I think it's relevant today as it was when it was written. There's still the same issues that we're dealing with. So first off, I always had I'll admit I had a bit of a complicated relationship with Michael's work. On the one hand, as compared to people that I really looked up to at the time when I was started, like Bill Warren, I always felt that Michael didn't put a lot of effort into making his work understandable, right? It's all written at extremely high level, as is his presentations. And I should start off by saying Michael Turvey is one of the smartest and best speakers I've ever seen, right? In terms of engaging the audience, technical speaking, being articulate. But I always was a bit frustrated because he didn't seem to put a lot of effort into making you understand what he was talking about, right? He spoke at a very, very high level. And I always kind of struggled with that. I've always believed in the famous quote, if they haven't learned, you didn't teach, right? So as I said, I struggle with that a bit. And, I'm a big person, obviously, from my books. I'm a big person with trying to simplify concepts and make people understand. And so it kind of went against mine. But over the years, I've become, I sort of embraced his approach and I understood it more and more. In some ways, it reminds me a little bit of what Franz Bosch has been trying to do, right? So Franz writes his books, and when he speaks, it's quite high level, right? And most people find it fairly difficult to understand upon first read. And so in some ways, he's doing what Michael Turvey did, right? He's speaking at these high level concepts. And I think both of them wanted to convey with their approach that this is not easy stuff, right? Especially like dynamical systems, applying that to perception action is not easy. And they didn't want to give people the illusion that they could just simply grab it and use it right away. One of Franz's favorite quotes I love is he'll say, you don't expect to learn how to do brain surgery in a weekend seminar at the local Hyatt, right? And that's what this stuff is. It's complicated. I think Michael wanted to convey some of that. He didn't want to give you the illusion that it's really simple and have you run off, which in ecological dynamics, we tend to do a little bit, right? An attractor is a very difficult concept, a mathematical concept. There's a bunch of different types of attractors, yet we just want to run off and apply it to everything that we see. So I gained to respect, and I think there's also a very different, I was lucky enough, kind of in my career, I got to sit in on a seminar with Michael Turvey at UConn. And there was a very different approach to when he gave a formal talk or one of his papers that we have restrictions when we publish a paper than when he was teaching students. He was an amazing teacher of students. He gave him his examples were so rich. And again, he didn't dumb it down, but he was very good at connecting. And the closest thing you can get from what he's written is his lectures on perception, right? That book. if you go through that and work through that, again, it's not going to be easy, right? Working through Michael Turvey's stuff is not going to be easy. And no one will say that, right? It's very complicated stuff. There's a lot of math in it, right? But it's very worthwhile, right? So I think, as I said, I've come to kind of change my view on Michael a little bit over time. And I really, really appreciate the work he's done. My very first encounter with Michael's work was when I first started getting into wanted to do research on baseball batting. And, it was when I was first setting up my simulation. I was going to run my first set of experiments. I read a paper, I believe it was by Fitch and Turvey, and I think it was in 87 or something like that. And what excited me was it was the first ever time I saw people talking about perception and action together. So in the paper, they present a fairly simple control strategy for hitting a baseball using tau, right? Adjusting the movement time of your swing based on tau. And before that, I've never, ever seen anybody talk about a movement variable, movement time, and a perceptual variable, tau, in the same sentence, right? And come up with a prediction that you could easily test, right? For me, it was groundbreaking, right? Everyone talked about, they use this perception to perceive a fastball. Well, what do you do with it then? What do you do? How do you swing? How do you hit it? So, I really think it. I think the chapter was called "On the Control of Activity: Some Remarks from an Ecological Point of View." So, Michael, in that chapter, there's a lot of other examples. He gives lots of great examples, and I tested that in my first paper. You'll see, and I think it was really, as I said, that was one of my first encounters with Michael Turvey. Michael Turvey, I think, and I'm no way trying to compare our careers, right? What we accomplished, but Michael Turvey, I found a lot of kinship and parallel, like with my career, because Michael Turvey was firmly grounded in information processing approach, right? That's what he learned. You look at his first studies were on iconic memory, right? A credibly information processing concept, if there ever was one, right? And he did a lot of good experiments on it. That's kind of what I did too. That's all I knew how to do. On the side, I read Gibson, I read the book Direct Perception, and I got excited about it, but I didn't really know how to do with it. And Michael had a very similar kind of view. And here's a quote from the chapter. This chapter by Gibson, a 1958-59 chapter on perception as a function of stimulation. And I have to say, once I read that chapter, that was about it. It was around 1965 that I read it. I thought that makes a lot of sense. It makes sense from a sports point of view. It made sense in my mind, at least. So Michael Turvey, if you don't know, Michael Turvey started educated in physical education, right? He was an athlete. He was a track and field athlete. And I think, with same as me, he kind of saw seems really logical for applying to sports. And so he switched to psychology. He thought that was the route to study skill acquisition in sports and things like that. Without having any of the relevant needed prerequisites, by the way, he got in. But he, as he said, when he first started, here's another quote, "It was not all obvious to me how we would do research as a Gibsonian, not at all. I was doing my research on iconic memory and short-term memory, particularly dynamics of proactive interference and short-term memory. Those were things I was mainly doing, exploring fundamental human information processing. But all the time I was still working in the background of what I meant to understand Gibson." Right? So that's kind of what I felt too. I didn't know how to do it. And that's one of, I think, Michael Turvey's, among his many contributions, right? Michael Turvey laid the framework for how to do research from an ecological psychology point of view, how to identify the information sources, how to identify the control laws, how to test them. And Michael Turvey, this is one of the things, another quote from the chapter. One of the things that he says really attracted him was, quote, "the notion that behavior is controlled without a controller. It is controlled. It's controlled by rules, but the rules are not in the brain. The rules are in the animal environment system." So Michael Turvey brought this idea of treating things as a system from Gibson. He kind of elucidated how we study it and things like that. So I think that that's one of the contributions I will always remember, right? If you look at the work Michael Turvey did, for example, on haptic perception, right? How do we identify the information? The inertial tensor, which is a type of information source, is a very difficult concept that he kind of worked through, and how to identify it. The other thing that I really in my mind, that I really appreciate Michael Turvey for was bringing Bernstein to connecting Bernstein and Gibson, right? So Michael Turvey was most of the Bernstein book that people have read, and I always cite. He was responsible for partly responsible for the translation of that, and bringing the two together, which, if you know anything, that's what ecological dynamics is, really. That's the two of them merging. And there's a few things, right? Michael Turvey, as I said, he has a great writings on the degrees of freedom problem. And when I was coming up, I read about the degrees of freedom problem in Schmidt and Lee's book and a few other places, and it was kind of, okay, that's it. Michael Turvey realized how profound a problem that was and how important it was, and how it understanding that laid the framework for all of motor control, right? And he also, as I've talked about on a few times on the podcast, he really understand the parallels between what Gibson was trying to do on the information side and what Bernstein was trying to do on the movement side. So Gibson was trying to tackle the problem of invariance, right? How does our perception stay the same when the information we're getting is changing all the time, right? Things are increasing in retinal image size, the angle of view. How can our perception stay the same? We have this abundant information, we have this one perception, right? That's exactly parallel to what Bernstein was trying to do. How do we move in this one way when we have all these possibilities, right? The degrees of freedom problem. So I think that was a really, really profound in bringing Bernstein to people and making this connection. All the work he's done on coordinated structures, all the synergies, he's written so many wonderful chapters pulling Bernstein's ideas out. And along with these kind of academic contributions in terms of paper, obviously Michael Turvey is the founding member of CESPA, the Center for the Ecological Study of Perception Action at UConn, one of the founding members, and which, everybody, I think, I could draw a family tree back to, right? So no matter who you are, so many people have come through there. It's such an amazing place. One of the beacons of ecological psychology. If I draw my little tree, I always mention the book that really set me on ecological psychology and ecological approach was Direct Perception by Claudio Carrillo and Claire Michaels. Claire Michaels is, of course, one of Michael Turvey's graduate students, right? So I can draw a line through there. So I think it's really, that it was a profound contribution as well. It's also, the interview is really interesting because it goes into some of the points that are still around, right? All the time. We still have, right? So if you put Michael's comments in the interview in context of all the Twitter bickering and all the stuff we see about skill acquisition in social media now, Michael Turvey had the same thing as his day. Quote, "There was a lot of opposition, tremendous opposition. I spent a lot of time hand-to-hand combat. Sometimes it would be me and 20 people and a lot of shouting and screaming at the top of their lungs. I would just sit there and fight, and they would just say, 'You're not a bad fighter.' That is science. These are ideas, and people just see them as their own. Suppose I would say, 'You don't need a motor program for that. That has got nothing to do with the motor program.' That would drive people crazy. What do you mean it has nothing to do with the motor program? That's where the structure is. No, the structure is arising from another principle." End quote. So Michael Turvey was making the same fights, the same arguments, right? I think that, it's, like I said before, it's very hard, and this is something I experienced, when you're grounded in information processing and that you have these things come from, programs and models and things, to switch your ideas to the complete opposite and the perspective control and things like that. So I think that, he's experienced some of the same thing. But another thing that I always acknowledge Michael Turvey for, and Claire Michaels really carried the torch with this, is the importance of sticking to the key principles, right? And sticking to an approach and having a clear theory. I've often said, and I get this directly from Claire, right? The idea that if you're going to use an ecological approach and find the information sources and find the control laws, right? It's not easy, right? And if you give yourself the option of appealing to some internal mechanism, some mental model, some predictive model, it's just a cop-out, really. It's going to weaken your ability to do ecological approach, right? So that's still how I feel about mixing approaches, right? You're going to weaken the ecological approach if you allow yourself to mix models, which I don't think makes a lot of sense. And Michael Turvey has a great quote about that in the interview too. You've always got to go for the commitment. I'm a person who really believes in no eclecticism. You've always got to go for the commitment. I'm a person who believes in not being eclectic. Eclectic gets too sloppy. If you go a little way on an idea and it's not coming to fruition, and if you add this disposition to think, oh, well, that we should just use some other ideas, then you actually never push the idea far enough. You never actually know whether it could do the job. I think an eclectic attitude forces people to take an idea, run with it a little way until it gets difficult, and then give up on it and go to another idea, right? So I'm sure that obviously applies to it depends approach and people that want to come up with a mixed model of direct and indirect perception, right? I agree 100% with them. If you allow yourself a mixed model, then you don't push one of them far enough, right? So it's the exact point I want to appeal, right? The other thing in book, Michael Turvey talks about the evidence for the ecological approach, and he obviously, I try to emphasize this, and I review things, and I have that page where I emphasize it. There's often, he emphasized patience, right? This is science. Science builds slowly. It's called incremental, right? Things don't happen rapidly. So I think, I agree, right? We want the proof that the ecological approach is better when there's no evidence that the other approach is better, really, over a placebo or anything like that. So, I agree with that as well. So I would encourage you to have a look at that interview that I've linked in the show notes if you want more information about Michael Turvey's career and how he came to be a hardcore Gibsonian from a person studying iconic memory, which is an incredibly information processing concept. And I think he gives a lot of personal insights and things. And as I said, in this episode, I just wanted to give a little tribute. I didn't want to try to make a summary of all his work. Hopefully you'll go back. You've seen some of Turvey's work in earlier episodes and some of the work I cite. I think his book, like I said, the lectures on perception and some of his book chapters he's written is the most accessible for me in understanding some of the key concepts. And I think, I thank him for, among a lot of things, like challenging me to think a bit harder, right? And recognizing that I couldn't just grab a concept by reading a paper in 10 minutes, right? I'm going to have to do some work to understand things like strong anticipation and coordinative structures, right? So I appreciate that effort, and I appreciate the amazing contributions he has made to the field of ecological psychology, and by offshoot, the ecological dynamics approach to skill, right? He has made major contributions to that as well. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including a monthly coaches meetup, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled. Gone through St. Louis.